Inequality, the defining challenge of our time, so said US President Barack Obama in 2013, but is wealth only set to concentrate as the rate of return on capital becomes greater than the rate of economic growth? This is the premise of controversial writer Thomas Piketty's book Capital in the 21st Century, who joins me now. Thomas, capitalism has lifted many people out of poverty, but does the gap between rich and poor really matter if both are getting richer?
Inequality is not a problem per se. Up to a point, inequality is actually useful for growth and innovation. The problem is when inequality becomes too extreme, then it becomes useless for growth, and it can even be bad because it tends to perpetuate inequality over time. It tends to reduce mobility. But let me say very clearly that I have no problem with inequality per se, and most of all what I've tried to do in this book is to tell the story of inequality, the story of money. I've put together with many colleagues vast historical evidence on income and wealth in over 20 countries across 3 centuries. And I am much better at analyzing the past than the future, and I don't pretend that the conclusions I draw about the future are the only possible ones. And the purpose of the book is to make these important issues accessible to everyone, because these are not just issues for economists. This is of interest for everybody.
Well, as you just said, your research is focused on the past. So how relevant do you think it is for policymakers of today?
Well, historical experience is our best guide, but of course, history always invents its own pathway. So, we think there's a lot to learn because there's already been some inequality crises in the past, certainly in the 19th century, at the first stage of the Industrial Revolution. Many people were asking, why is it that, we have all this industrial growth and still very low wages for vast groups of the population, and children working in the mines at the age of 6. And this was overcome by a mixture of market forces, labor laws, free schools, taxation systems that can pay for better health system for everyone. So there were crises, there was a response. So, and I am confident that we can also find response to the current inequality crisis, which I should say, is particularly strong in the United States, where the rise of inequality has indeed been quite large in the past 2 to 3 decades. In Europe, it has been much less strong so far, but maybe that's not a reason to wait that it becomes as big as in the US, but the story I'm telling is not a deterministic story where, inequality has to rise or inequality has to decline. There are different forces that play together in different ways in different parts of the world.
Well, I want to look at a quote from your book now. So you said, when a government taxes a certain level of income or inheritance at a rate of 70 or 80%, the primary goal is obviously not to raise additional revenue. It is rather to put an end to such incomes and large estates which lawmakers have come to regard as socially unacceptable and economically unproductive. Well, of course, the idea of capitalism is people are rewarded for working hard, and on the sort of upper scale, that is, of course, with large incomes and large estates. And then that becomes cyclical because they employ people and resources, which creates wealth. So are you suggesting that maybe there should be a glass ceiling on how much people can achieve?
For a very long period of time, for instance, in the United States, between 1930 and 1980, the top marginal income tax rate on average was 82%. This did not destroy American capitalism. And the reason for that is that this was applied only to very, very high income, so typically above $1 or $2 million of annual income. And at that level of income, it's not clear whether inequality is really useful for growth. So, when you pay a manager 10 million instead of 1 or 50 instead of 10, of course, these people are saying that this is useful for growth and this is useful for the rest of society, but the evidence for that, is quite weak. Above a certain point, inequality is not really all that useful. And I think that's the reason why, historically, the growth performance of the US economy was not actually lower than what it has been since 1980. If anything, the growth rate were higher in the 50s, 60s, 70s than what they've been since the 80s.
Your book suggests we can reduce inequality without giving up the benefits of capitalism. You proposed a global tax on all assets. So could you walk me through your proposal?
Well, first, investment in education is the most important policy. Now, sometimes it's not sufficient to prevent inequality from rising, so you also need progressive taxation of top incomes, as we've talked about before. Now, progressive taxation of wealth, is also important This can be done, a lot can be done at the national level. With international cooperation, we can do more because we can better tax the very top part of the distribution and in particular very large financial assets. So here we need automatic transmission of information and we need to move toward more financial transparency, generally speaking. So we need to have a registry of cross-border financial assets so that we know who owns what. You know, this is useful for taxation, but this is also useful for financial regulation because it's very difficult to solve a banking crisis at a large scale, if you don't know who owns what in what banks.
You have admitted your proposed tax system would be impossible on a global scale, and in effect it would trigger a national brain drain. So what's your solution to tax avoidance or loopholes, or people just moving to tax havens?
This is difficult, but that doesn't mean this is impossible. 5 years ago, everybody would have said that bank secrecy in Switzerland will be with us forever. And then, finally, there were some US sanctions against Swiss bank, and, the Swiss banks had to accept. It's a bit sad that the European countries themselves were not able to solve the problem, which in a way, it's much more of a concern for them than for the US. But still, I want to read this episode in a sort of optimistic and positive way, which is that if you put the proper sanctions, this can work.
Well, if I might ask a very cheeky question, obviously best-selling author, Capital in the 21st Century, you must have sort of earned quite a bit from that. So you tempted to move to the UK for, I think it's 183 days, so you can pay tax here rather than France?
No, I belong to a minority in the population with pretty high income and wealth, and who doesn't have to worry too much about money. And to me, this is what money is here for. The money is, you want people to have enough money that they can think about something else. And I am fortunate enough that I don't need to worry too much about my money. But I would like more people not to worry as much as they do. And I think for this we need better institutions, so that it's easier for the bottom half of the population or the next 40%, which I call the middle class in my book, to access wealth without writing a bestseller book.
The FT said that there were many unexplained data entries and errors in the figures underlying some of the book's key charts. What was it like to have your entire research questioned?
They made a lot of noise out of nothing at all. Everybody can look at my response online, and I think anybody spending 30 minutes on the issue will conclude that they've made a lot of noise out of nothing at all. I mean, I have no problem with debate. I think I try to put everything online so that we can have an open and transparent debate. I think it's a bit sad that the FT seems to be so afraid with my book. I think they should be afraid with the reality, and they should try to be a bit more constructive, in my view. But it's okay. I think at the end of the day, they've made me a lot of publicity and they've been damaging their own reputation.
Well, your book has found its way on very influential world leaders' desks, if you like. So what do you think politicians should take away from your book?
The book tells us that there's no natural force that prevents inequality from rising to excessive levels, and that we need to ensure through proper educational institutions, fiscal institutions, that somehow we manage to keep track and to keep control of how these things are changing. Some of the evolutions that I am describing in the direction of more wealth taxation and less labor taxation, to some extent is happening when we think of the debate about the mansion tax in Britain, the wealth tax in Spain. So, some of these evolutions are already happening, but at the same time, the forces of competition between countries, in order to attract investment, and so you are very tempted to just, steal the tax base of your neighbor, basically. And yeah, we need more coordination, and this is what I think our political leaders should focus upon. So we are going to have a European-American treaty next year. The United States is 1/4 of world GDP. The European Union is another 1/4 of world GDP. This is 1/2 of world GDP. So if this is not sufficiently big to bring more financial transparency, more coordination in order to tax multinationals and in order to fight tax havens, what are we doing?
So finally, what's next for you? The rockstar economist, what's next on your agenda?
I plan to work more and more in emerging countries, and wealth inequality is not only an issue for developed economies. In China, this is becoming a really big issue, and So far, they've been addressing the problem mostly on a case-by-case basis. You know, when an oligarch gets really too rich, they just put him in jail, and a little bit like in Russia. But you know, they're starting to realize that this is not a very efficient way to regulate the dynamics of wealth distribution and accumulation. So they're actively talking about introducing some form of property and wealth tax, and yeah, I plan to work a lot more on inequality in emerging countries in the future.
Thomas, thank you.
Thank you.